Freud, a complete guide in 20 minutes. Hello everyone, welcome back, or if you're new here, hi, it's lovely to have you. This is Psych for Psychology, and today we will cover the infamous psychologist Sigmund Freud. This is a concise overview. We will include the historical context of his work, his major theories like the unconscious mind and the ego-superego model, psychosexual development, and his long-lasting influence, including the criticisms and where his work stands today. So, who was Freud? Sigmund Freud was an Austrian neurologist and the founder of psychoanalysis. He developed groundbreaking and often controversial ideas about the unconscious mind, childhood development, and mental illness. Born in 1856 in what is now the Czech Republic, Freud was a pioneering figure in the field of psychology. His family was Jewish and they moved to Vienna when he was just 4 years old. Vienna would remain the intellectual backdrop of most of his life. He was an exceptional student and went on to study medicine at the University of Vienna, originally focusing on neurology. His early work included detailed anatomical studies of the brain and somewhat controversially research into the medical uses of cocaine. His personal life was not without challenges. Freud faced widespread criticism, and his Jewish identity made him a target of anti-Semitic discrimination, particularly as the Nazis rose to power. In 1938, after Austria was annexed by Nazi Germany, Freud and his family fled to London. He died just 1 year later, in 1939, after a long battle with jaw cancer. Despite the controversy and complexity of his ideas, Freud's life was defined by curiosity about the mind, identity, and the human experience. But it was Freud's exposure to Jean-Martin Charcot in Paris that sparked major turning point. Charcot was using hypnosis to treat hysteria, and Freud became increasingly fascinated by the idea that psychological symptoms could have unconscious causes. Returning to Vienna, Freud began working with Joseph Breuer, and together they explored the now famous case of Anna, a woman suffering from physical symptoms with no medical explanation. This case laid groundwork for what Freud would soon call psychoanalysis. When people think of Freud, they often think of this one big idea, the unconscious mind. Freud believed that our mind isn't just what we're consciously thinking and feeling. In fact, what we're aware of is just the tip of the iceberg. Beneath that, there's the preconscious, kind of mental waiting room where thoughts sit just outside of awareness. We can bring them into consciousness if we try, for example, remembering what you had for dinner last night. But even deeper lies a conscious mind. This is where Freud believed we store repressed memories, forbidden desires, traumatic experiences, and instincts, especially those related to sex and aggression, the topics that our conscious mind finds too threatening to deal with. In Freud's theory, understanding the unconscious was the key to understanding the self. It's a bold idea, and whether you agree with it or not, it changed the way we talk about the mind forever. Freud argued that these hidden elements don't stay buried, they leak out in subtle and not so subtle ways. For example, through dreams, Freudian slips like accidentally calling your teacher mum, or even through physical symptoms with no clear medical cause. He saw repression as the mind's way of defending us, keeping painful or socially unacceptable thoughts out of conscious awareness. But the cost of this repression, anxiety, neuroses, and conflict, to help people heal, Freud believed you had to go deeper below the surface. This is where he used free association, encouraging patients to say whatever came to mind, and dream analysis, where he interpreted symbolic meanings behind people's dreams. Now that we've covered Freud's idea of the unconscious, let's dive into how he believed the mind was structured. Freud proposed that our personality is shaped by the constant interaction between three mental forces, the it, the ego, and the superego. Each one plays a different role, and their conflict forms the foundation of human behavior. First up, the it is the most primitive part of our mind. It's present from birth, and it's entirely unconscious. Think of the it as your inner animal driven by raw instinctive desires. It operates on what Freud called the pleasure principle, which means it wants what it wants. And now, whether it's hunger, sex, aggression, or comfort, the it doesn't care about rules or consequences. It only wants to satisfy the urge. Picture toddlers screaming supermarket aisle. That's the it in action, demanding, impulsive, and unaware of social norms. Next, the ego. As we grow up and interact with the world, the ego develops. It's the rational part of our personality, and it operates mostly in the conscious and preconscious mind. The ego works according to the reality principle. It understands that we can't always get what we want, at least not right away. Its job is to find realistic, socially acceptable ways to meet the its demands. Think of the ego as mediator. It balances the wild impulse of it with the moral standards of the superego, all while dealing with real-world challenges. When this balancing act creates anxiety, The ego uses defense mechanisms like repression or denial to keep us psychologically stable. We will cover these mechanisms shortly. And finally, the superego. The superego is the moral part of the mind. It develops around the age of 5 as children internalize the values, norms, and expectations of their parents and society. It operates partly in the conscious and unconscious mind, and it has two main components: the conscience, which punishes us with guilt when we do something bad, and the ego ideal, which rewards us with pride when we live up to high standards. If the it is like devil on your shoulder, the superego is the angel constantly judging your thoughts and actions, often harshly. According to Freud, these three forces are in constant tension. The it pushes for instant gratification, the superego imposes moral restrictions, and the ego tries to keep the peace while managing reality. This internal conflict is the root of many psychological struggles. Too much it, you might act selfishly or recklessly. Too much superego, you could become rigid, anxious, or guilt-ridden. A well-functioning ego keeps everything in check. So we've explored the constant conflict between the it ego and superego. But what happens when that conflict creates too much anxiety? Freud believed the ego has secret weapon, defense mechanisms. These unconscious mental strategies protect us from overwhelming emotions, unwanted thoughts, or painful realities. They help us cope but often distort the truth in the process. Let's go through some of the most well-known ones. First up, repression. This is the most fundamental defense mechanism according to Freud. Repression involves pushing distressing memories or desires deep into the unconscious, so we don't have to deal with them consciously. For example, someone who experienced a traumatic event in childhood might have no memory of it, but it still influences their behavior or dreams. Denial is when we refuse to accept reality, especially when it's painful. Imagine someone who continues to smoke heavily while insisting, it's not that bad for me. The facts are clear, but the ego blocks them out to avoid anxiety. Projection happens when we experience a thought, feeling, or desire that makes us anxious or uncomfortable. So instead of acknowledging it, our mind unconsciously says, that's not mine, it's theirs. We push that unwanted part of ourselves onto someone else. Imagine someone who frequently feels angry but doesn't want to admit it to themselves. Instead, they walk around insisting that everyone else is hostile or has problems this way. The ego protects us, projecting the unacceptable feeling outward. Displacement involves redirecting emotions to a less threatening target. A classic example, your boss shouts at you, but you can't shout back. So you go home and snap at your partner or scream at a pillow. The emotion is the same, but it's aimed at safer outlets. And now let's look at rationalization, another defense mechanism we probably all use sometimes without even noticing. Rationalization is when the ego creates believable, logical excuse for something we've done, said, or felt, especially when the real reason might be too uncomfortable to admit. It's basically the mind's way of saying, let's make this make sense. Imagine a student who fails test. Rather than facing the anxiety of not studying enough, they say, well, exam was unfair, or I didn't really care about that module anyway, and that reframes the situation to protect their self-esteem. Reaction formation. In reaction formation, we behave in the opposite way to how we actually feel. For example, someone who feels insecure about their sexuality may act overly critical of others who are openly LGBTQ+, its way of covering or denying those feelings. Finally, sublimation is considered one of the most healthy and mature defenses. It involves channeling unacceptable urges into socially acceptable activities. Think of someone with aggressive impulses who becomes a boxer, or someone with sexual energy who pours it into creating art or music. The emotion is redirected in a way that's constructive. So we all use defense mechanisms, some more than others, and most of the time they help us cope with everyday stress. But when we overuse them or rely on them to avoid real problems, they can get in the way of healthy psychological development. Freud believed that becoming aware of our defense mechanisms was an important part of therapy and of becoming more in control of our own minds. Let's talk about Freud and dreams. Topic that launched psychoanalysis into popular culture and shaped how we think about the sleeping mind. Freud believed dreams were far more than random brain activity. In fact, he called them the royal road to the unconscious. To him, dreams weren't meaningless. They were coded messages from the parts of ourselves we don't fully understand. So how do dreams work? Manifest versus latent content. Freud made an important distinction between the manifest content and the latent content of the dream. The manifest content is what we actually remember when we wake up, the story, the images, the bizarre scenes. But underneath it is the latent content, the true, hidden meaning, often based on repressed wishes, unresolved conflicts, and primitive desires. The manifest content disguises the latent content in symbol form, often to protect us from the anxiety that raw, unconscious desires might trigger. Dream work, the mind's editing process. Freud said that process called dream work transforms our unconscious thoughts into the symbolic, surreal stories we experience during dreams. There are several mechanisms at play. Displacement. Emotional importance is shifted from one object or person to another. For instance, your anxiety about work might appear as dream about monsters chasing you. Condensation. Multiple ideas or people are combined into one, like dream character who seems like your boss, your parent, and your teacher all at once. Symbolism. Objects or events in dreams stand in for deeper psychological content. Freud was especially interested in sexual symbolism, sometimes controversially suggesting that long objects like swords or sticks might symbolize male genitalia, while boxes, caves, or water could represent the feminine. Case study: Irma's injection in the interpretation of dreams, 1900. Freud shares his own dream. The famous Irma's injection case, it was one of the first examples he analyzed in detail. In the dream, his patient Irma becomes ill and Freud is told someone else gave her for the injection. Freud interpreted this dream as reflecting his own guilt and anxiety about professional responsibility and desire to shift the blame onto others. Freud's dream theory has been criticized especially for overemphasizing sex and symbolism, but his core idea that dreams reveal the emotional truths we hide from ourselves remains powerful. Modern psychologists still explore the meaning of dreams, not always in Freudian terms, but often inspired by the idea that what we suppress by day may speak to us at night. Let's now look at one of Freud's most ambitious and debated theories, the psychosexual stages of development. Freud believed that personality develops through a series of stages in early childhood, each centered around the pleasure and conflict associated with different areas of the body, which he called erogenous zones. According to Freud, how we resolve the conflicts of each stage determines the foundation of our adult personality. The first stage is the oral stage, where the mouth is the center of pleasure. Babies explore the world through sucking, biting, and chewing. If an infant's oral needs are not properly met, say, they are weaned too early or fed inconsistently, Freud believed this could lead to an oral fixation in adulthood. Traits like dependency, overeating, smoking, or nail biting could be signs of unresolved oral stage issues. Next is the anal stage, centered on toilet training. Here, the focus is on control over the body, but symbolically over one's environment. If parents are too strict or too lenient during toilet training, this may lead to one of two fixations: the anal retentive personality, obsessively tidy, controlling, perfectionistic; the anal expulsive personality, messy, disorganized, rebellious. Stage 3. Phallic stage 3, 6 years. The phallic stage is where things get more complex, ND more controversial. The focus is on the genitals, but not in sexualized adult sense. It's about discovering identity and difference. This is the stage where Freud introduced the Oedipus complex, the idea that boys unconsciously desire their mothers and view their fathers as rivals. Through resolving this conflict, the child eventually identifies with the same-sex parent, forming the beginnings of gender identity and the superego. Freud proposed para-electra complex for girls, though he was less clear and more controversial here, leading to criticism even from his own followers. Stage 4. Latency stage, 6 to 12 years after all the emotional drama of the phallic stage. The latency stage is comparatively calm. Freud believed sexual energy is repressed and focus shifts toward learning, friendships, and skill building. Although there's no new erogenous zone, this period is crucial for developing social skills and sense of competence. Stage 5. Genital stage, 12 years plus. The final stage begins at puberty and continues into adulthood. The genital stage is where the individual ideally becomes capable of mature, adult relationships and healthy sexual expression. Successful navigation of earlier stages means the person can now love and work, as Freud famously summarized the goals of adulthood. Final thoughts: Freud's psychosexual theory has drawn criticism for being untestable, overly focused on sexuality, and based on male-centric, Western assumptions. However, many modern developmental psychologists credit Freud for highlighting how early childhood shapes adult personality. Whether we take the stages literally or symbolically, Freud's theory remains a powerful lens for exploring the emotional challenges of growing up. Let's now turn to what Freud is perhaps best known for. Not just his theories, but his practice. Freud didn't just study the mind, he tried to help people heal it, and in doing so, he created what became known as psychoanalysis, the first form of talking therapy in psychology. So then, what is psychoanalysis? Psychoanalysis is based on one core idea: that psychological symptoms come from unresolved unconscious conflict. Freud believed that by bringing these unconscious thoughts and feelings into conscious awareness, people could gain insight, reduce their psychological distress, and regain control of their lives. This was not quick fix therapy, it was deep, slow, and often intense. The therapeutic process in psychoanalysis, the patient would typically lie on a couch. Freud sat behind them, out of sight. The idea was to remove visual distractions and encourage a free flow of thoughts. The primary technique, free association, that is asking the patient to say whatever came to mind without censorship or judgment. Even if it seemed silly, irrelevant, or uncomfortable, Freud believed that slips of the tongue, tangents, and pauses all revealed unconscious material. This is where we get the idea of the Freudian slip when someone says one thing but means their mother. See what I did there? Or rather, unconsciously reveals hidden thought. Dream analysis revisited. Dream analysis was another key method Freud used. As we explored earlier, dreams were seen as expressions of repressed wishes, and decoding them could lead to valuable insight into the patient's inner world. He would help the patient analyze the symbols, themes, and emotional tone of their dreams, interpreting both the manifest content and the latent content. Transference and countertransference, one of Freud's most original contributions, was the concept of transference. This is when patient unconsciously transfers feelings about important people in their life, like parents, onto the therapist. For example, they might become angry with the therapist as if they were critical father, or affectionate as if they were caring mother. Freud saw this as an opportunity. By working through these feelings in therapy, the patient could resolve long-standing emotional conflicts. Similarly, countertransference refers to the therapist's own emotional reactions to the patient, something modern therapists are trained to monitor carefully. What was the goal? Importantly, the goal of psychoanalysis wasn't just to remove symptoms, it was to change the person by uncovering the root cause of their suffering. Freud believed that once people became aware of the true source of their conflict, they could develop healthier ways of relating to themselves and others. This took time, often years, and required an intense therapeutic relationship, but for Freud it was worth it. Freud's methods are no longer widely used in their original form, but they laid the groundwork for almost every talking therapy that followed. From psychodynamic therapy to modern counseling, his influence remains deep. He also reshaped the way we think about mental health, suggesting that emotional wounds could come not just from biology or trauma, but from our inner life, our thoughts, our desires, and our past. Although classical psychoanalysis with its daily couch sessions and years-long intensity is now rare, Freud's influence is very much alive in what we call modern psychodynamic therapy. This is where Freud's ideas meet modern clinical practice. From couch to clinic days, psychodynamic therapists still explore the unconscious, early childhood experiences and internal conflicts, but in more accessible and flexible ways. Modern sessions are usually once or twice per week, and the therapist often sits face-to-face. Rather than the strict neutrality of Freud's method, therapists now emphasize collaborative and supportive relationship. Insight is still key, but it's built through shared understanding, not long silences. Core principles of psychodynamic therapy. Modern psychodynamic therapy retains several core principles from Freud. The past shapes the present, especially early relationships with caregivers. Unconscious processes influence thoughts, emotions, and behavior. Emotional problems often stem from internal conflicts and unmet needs. The therapeutic relationship itself can reveal important dynamics. However, modern approaches also integrate newer theories like object relations, how early attachments form templates for relationships. Attachment theory inspired by Bowlby, highlighting emotional bonds. Relational psychoanalysis, focusing on mutual influence between client and therapist. Short-term psychodynamic therapy. Here, one key development is the rise of brief psychodynamic therapy, time-limited treatment, e.g. 1 to 4 sessions focused on specific issue. These therapies have been shown to be effective for depression, anxiety disorders, trauma and PTSD, relationship issues, even personality disorders where deeper patterns are at play. They've been validated through clinical trials, something Freud's original approach lacked. Psychoanalysis reimagined in some parts of Europe. Traditional psychoanalysis still exists, but it's usually updated, more relational, and informed by contemporary neuroscience and developmental psychology. Rather than being replaced, Freud's model has been refined, taking the useful parts and leaving the unuseful behind. As influential as Freud was, his theories have never been without controversy. In fact, Freud's legacy may be just as much about the debate he sparked as the theories he proposed. Let's look at some of the major criticisms and why so many psychologists take Freud with a heavy pinch of salt. One of the most common criticisms is that Freud's work lacks empirical support. Many of his ideas, like the it, ego, and superego or Oedipus complex, are difficult to test scientifically. You can't easily observe or measure the unconscious, and Freud didn't use controlled experiments. This led philosopher of science Karl Popper to call psychoanalysis non-falsifiable, meaning that no matter what evidence you present, the theory can always twist to fit outcome, and in modern psychology, that's our big red flag. Freud placed enormous weight on sexual development, especially in children. The psychosexual stages, oral, anal, phallic, etc., suggest that adult personality is shaped almost entirely by how we resolve conflicts in early childhood. While early experience is important, many critics feel Freud went too far, reducing complex human behavior to unresolved childhood trauma and sexual tension. Modern developmental psychology offers nuanced and evidence-based explanations, and it is easy to see why this is frowned upon. Freud's theories were largely based on small, non-representative groups of clients, mostly middle and upper-class Viennese adults. He often generalized from these few cases to all people, and sometimes retrospectively fit his interpretations to suit his theory. Modern psychologists value diverse samples, peer-reviewed data, and replicable results, things Freud rarely provided. Another major criticism is Freud's attitude toward women. He famously described women as experiencing penis envy and suggested they had weaker superegos than men. He also viewed femininity in terms of absence and lack. Many feminists, from Karen Horney to Simone Beauvoir, challenged Freud's views, arguing they reflected cultural bias, not psychological truth. Modern psychology aims to be more inclusive, intersectional, and reflect different gender identities and experiences. Beyond academic psychology, Sigmund Freud has become a cultural symbol, possibly the most famous psychologist of all time. Even if people don't know his theories, they know him, or at least a cartoon version of him. So where does all this leave us? Sigmund Freud was far from perfect. His theories can be flawed, his language problematic, and his evidence lacking by modern standards. And yet you can't talk about psychology without talking about Freud. He changed the way we think about thinking by proposing that much of what drives us is hidden beneath the surface. He gave us ideas like the unconscious mind, defense mechanisms, and the inner conflict of the ego and superego, or concepts that echoed far beyond therapy rooms into our everyday language and culture. Yes, he was criticized, perhaps rightly so, for his obsession with sexuality, his narrow sample base, and his exclusion of women and diverse voices. But Freud's real contribution may not be in his answers, it's in the questions he asked. He dared to ask, what if we don't really know ourselves? What if our past shaped our present more than we realize? What if talking could heal? Whether you're a student of psychology or just fascinated by the mind, Freud's legacy goes on. In every therapy session, every debate about mental health, and every story about what it means to be human, this is Psyched for Psychology. Thanks for watching this deep dive into Sigmund Freud, the man who helped bring the unconscious mind to the surface. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss our journey into the world of psychology. We're here to unpack big theories, challenge old ideas, and bring academic insight to everyone, whether you are a student, a professional, or just a curious mind. Let me know in the comments what you think about Freud, revolutionary thinker, overrated, or something in between.